各位朋友，大家晚上好！欢迎各位参加由 Mentoring 蒙科和组织隐性知识管理全球智库联合主办的组织隐性知识管理大师系列讲座50场。今天是第26场，由来自美国的 Josh Plaskoff 博士给我们来分享。他今天分享的主题是隐性知识的关系性。那这里呢，涉及到一个比喻，就是一个很美的比喻，是说这是一部3乐章组成的交响曲。那首先让我们来认识一下今晚的演讲嘉宾，我们的 Josh 博士。那 Josh 博士他是一位组织思想领袖，然后他创办了 interhuman group， 然后他在组织学习和实践社群方面的开创性工作，对全球的组织发展和学习带来了重要影响。在世界范围内受到了广泛认可。那此外呢，他有多年的企业经历，他曾经在世界500强施乐、世界领先的制药公司礼来，然后美国的医疗保险巨头安森等大型企业担任过高管。那同时他也有多年的高校教授经验，比如他曾经是印第安纳大学的 MBA 教授，那目前呢，他在普渡大学担任组织领导力教授。那在他多年的这个工作研究生涯当中呢，他发表了20多篇文章。那目前也在撰写一本关于组织发展关系方法的一本书。今天的讲座主办方是蒙科和组织隐性知识管理全球智库 GO-TKM。首先 Mentoring 蒙科是源自1981年，是企业导师技术及组织隐性知识管理的全球知名教育咨询品牌。蒙科的总部在比利时布鲁塞尔，在全球有近600名专业顾问，在41个国家和地区为各类组织机构提供组织隐性知识萃取和企业导师传承相结合的培训与咨询服务。蒙科中国是专注在国内本土市场开展企业导师制以及组织隐性知识管理培训和咨询服务的。然后蒙科我们是目前欧洲导师与教练协会受证的中国唯一导师服务机构，提供 EMCC 认证的导师课程，同时也是国际职业导师协会在中国的独家授权合作伙伴。组织隐性技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 是注册在比利时布鲁塞尔的非营利性国际智库。我们智库的成立旨在推动组织隐性知识管理在全社会的运用，推动人类的高效率学习。那现在我们就把今天的舞台交给我们的演讲嘉宾。Now let's warmly welcome Dr. Josh Plaskoff.
Hi, my name is Dr. Josh Plaskoff. I live in the United States, in the state of Indiana, and I'm honored to be here today to talk with you about tacit knowledge, my experiences with tacit knowledge, and I thank the mentoring company for inviting me to participate. I wanted you to see me full face first before I put up my presentation, so I'll introduce myself more deeply when I get the presentation up. So let me do that right now. I will share with you. Put myself way up in the corner here so that it doesn't block the actual content. So I call this a journey toward the relationality of tacit knowledge, a symphony in 3 movements. I'll explain what that is, why I chose that. I chose that for a particular reason, but I wanted to let you know what my talk was first about. And let me introduce myself a little bit further. I like to say that I have a life of learning. As I said, my name is Josh Plaskoff. I have had a career in industry over 30 years, leading organizations, doing organizational work. I've also had a 20-year concurrent academic career where I've taught at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana. I'm currently teaching in the organizational leadership faculty at Purdue University. I also founded a consulting group called the Interhuman Group, and Interhuman actually is an acknowledgement to the philosopher Martin Buber. Martin Buber introduced the idea of betweenness of people. And so the focus that I have, and I'll introduce this in my talk, is the idea of relationality and the idea that we are not just individuals connecting with each other, but the real meat of what happens with human beings is in the betweenness, the between who they are. And so you'll see that come up in this. The reason I say that I have a life of learning, and learning will come up in this discussion as well, is that when I was young, I loved every single topic. I loved physics, I loved English, I loved history, I love languages, and I always envied those people that had a single thing that they enjoyed to do, like playing a musical instrument or math. I never did. Even when I went to college, I studied both physiology and English. And it took me a long time to realize that really my focus, my career focus, my interest, my passion was on learning in general and knowledge in general. And that's how I got engaged in knowledge management and the ideas of tacit knowledge. And so this is an extension of my passion and my interest and my career interests. So that's a little bit about me. Let me explain to you why I chose this title. So Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist in England. He also teaches literature or humanities, and that's another reason why I admire him. But besides his writings, I think his writings are fantastic. But I found this quote of his that I really think is applicable to our conversation today. Music consists entirely of relations, betweenness. The notes mean nothing in themselves. The tensions between the notes and between notes and the silence with which they live in reciprocal indebtedness are everything. Music to me is one of the things that represents our struggle with tacit knowledge. What we have in music is an expression of the inexpressible, the emotional, the non-rational. And we try, like you'll see the notes on the side, we try to represent them in some kind of a rational system, some kind of a way of capturing that, but it's very hard to capture that. And each symphony, each piece of music that you play, even though it's written down and it was created, each instance in which people play it is going to be different. And it's really a collaboration between the listeners and the producers of the music, and the producers of the music and each other. The symphony orchestras are always greater than the sum of their parts. It's not about the individual instruments. It's about how they together create this music. And so I thought that this was really appropriate for this talk about tacit knowledge, because it's really sort of the essence of tacit knowledge. So let me explain to you also why it's set up into movements. So as you know, probably music is, symphonies at least, are usually movements. And what I decided to do with this talk was kind of, instead of throwing a bunch of theory, was to really kind of trace my thinking and my experience, my story, if you will. And narratives and stories play a lot of role in tacit knowledge, of a discovery of the idea of tacit knowledge and what it means and what it is. And so I have three movements that are part of this discovery. The first movement is, I call discovery and rebellion, and this is sort of a my introduction into learning and to thinking about learning and thinking about knowledge, and sort of my exposure to some of the early ideas, and then a rebellion against some of those ideas. The second movement I call sociocultural understanding. And this is when I took that rebellion and started to apply it in a new way to the idea of learning within communities, and the sociocultural aspects of learning in organizations. And then the final movement is the movement that is still underway. And this is the experiment that I'm sort of presenting to you because I'm still thinking through it. But it is my third movement that I'm currently in, which is moving from sociocultural understanding to relationality, where basically the tacit knowledge is embedded within relationships themselves, and that the relationships come first. So what I'm going to do is trace through this for you and kind of expose some of my thinking, some of my challenges, some of my ideas, hopefully pointing to a dialogue and creating a sense of dialogue, because I think that's important as part of tacit knowledge. You'll see the idea of creating dialogue and creating a space for dialogue. So this is not scripted. I think also in the spirit of tacit knowledge, I don't want to use a script. I want to spontaneously talk about what comes up in my head and try to express that tacit knowledge to you. So this is the first thing I want to throw out is the idea of learning. To understand tacit knowledge, we must understand it in the context of learning. I see a lot of times that we talk about tacit knowledge and we really don't talk about learning. And learning to me is the essence of being a human being. I start all of my classes by re-teaching my students what learning truly is, because I think in a lot of ways we have distorted what learning is all about. Learning is not about an event. Learning is not about memorizing knowledge and spitting it back on a test. Learning is an existential part of us being a human being. And I think this is more difficult than it seems, because actually I've gotten both my master's and my PhD in learning, and we've spent very little time actually defining learning, talking about what it really is. There's an assumption that we know what it is. But if you think about knowledge, you think about tacit knowledge, really the essence of it, the act of it is learning. It's part of learning, and learning is part of our everyday life, and I think that it's part of who we are as human beings. And so what I'm going to do is actually frame this in terms of different perspectives of learning that I saw and how tacit knowledge fits into those different perspectives of learning. So my first movement, what I call discovery and rebellion. As a symphony, each movement usually has a theme. Sometimes there's a theme in the whole symphony. So I have a musical theme, and those musical themes are actually definitions of learning that I have pulled out that represent sort of the starting place of this particular movement. So for this first movement, I chose a definition from Colquitt, who wrote an organizational behavior book. And this is a pretty traditional view of learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. This refers to a change in behavior, an external change that we can observe. So what strikes me in this, and what hit me with this was the idea of behavior, first of all, because behavior comes from the behaviorist school of thought in terms of psychology. The idea that thinking is not what's critical. What's important is observing things, and that learning is really not about thinking about what's going on in people's heads. It's about observing behaviors, and behaviors are things that you can control and that you can predict. And so this is what framed sort of the first exposure that I had to knowledge and to learning. And I felt very uncomfortable with this. I bought in on it at the beginning. I was working at Xerox, and we were creating a training program for service representatives who service the big laser printers. And we followed a very structured approach to learning, which is creating behavioral objectives that we could measure by having them demonstrate their knowledge, and that we would structure things to address behaviors rather than any kind of thinking or problem solving. And that was sort of the way that learning was considered to be most effective. So I had a rebellion, and this rebellion happened. I can actually tell you the exact date. The date is highlighted here. It was March 22nd, 1989. And I was working for Xerox at the time, and we were implementing this training program in Leesburg, Virginia, at the training center for Xerox. And the reason that I know that date is because it was my birthday in 1989. And to celebrate my birthday, my boss and our team members went to the bar at the training center. There was a bar at the training center. Now, something had always kind of confused me about this work that I was doing, because the service representatives didn't like our courses. They thought they were a waste of time. They kind of groaned every time they came into class. but they loved coming to the training center, and they would come there for 5 weeks at a time. So it was really odd that I thought that, they're spending all of their day in the training classes, which they didn't like, but they loved coming to the training center. And that was always a question for me about, so what is going on here? Well, my March 22nd, 1989 answered that question for me. When we went to the bar, I would look around and I saw our students, and they were sitting at tables, and they were drinking beers and talking with each other and sharing things that weren't in the documentation, and sharing experiences and arguing with each other and talking about smells in the machine, things that you couldn't necessarily write down in words. And what I saw happening was really my first exposure to tacit knowledge in action, that I could recognize. And I realized what was happening in our classes and why our classes and our learning experience was so ineffective, because it didn't deal with tacit knowledge. It only dealt with explicit knowledge, and explicit knowledge wasn't going to give them the skills that they needed to really perform well on the job. And so this is when I rebelled against what we were doing. And I realized that we had to look at a different way of learning. We had to look at a way of learning that allowed people to learn with each other, to talk with each other, to share with each other, to experiment, to play, to allow for dealing with some of those things that were intangible. So this was my discovery, and this is where it triggered my new approaches to thinking about learning and about knowledge. Now, this led to the second movement. The second movement I call the sociocultural understanding. And the quote that I have on here is from a friend of mine and co-worker at a point at one time. We worked together. Etienne Wenger. Etienne Wenger was really wrote the book on communities of practice, and he and Jean Lave came up with the concept. And he said, when I talked to him one time, knowledge is the social history of learning. And this really resonated with me, to really rethink knowledge, moving away from this behaviorist kind of approach where basically everything was cause and effect, everything was predictive, everything was controlled, everything was structured, to thinking that actually knowledge is embedded within the social environment, the sociocultural environment, and that history plays a role in understanding learning and understanding how this knowledge can be accessed. So one of the things that's interesting about tacit knowledge in my work in organizations, and I share this with a lot of people, is that the understanding is that 90% of knowledge within organizations is tacit, 10% is explicit. And yet, if we look at learning programs and we look at what the time that we spend on designing programs and implementing programs, 90% of them are formal programs, and only 10% are informal. And informal learning is where a lot of the tacit knowledge sharing takes place. And so it's almost backwards. And I always felt that was a problem, because we weren't really mobilizing tacit knowledge within our organizations. What we were dealing with is only the 10%. And I thought that was not the appropriate way of working. So what I discovered, and this is my connection with Etienne. I had known about Etienne when I was working at Xerox, and he had come up with this concept of communities of practice. I had known him actually from working with artificial intelligence and systems. And here he appeared again with this concept of communities of practice. Now, I took a slightly different approach to communities of practice than he did, but some of the concepts that were behind, or the premises behind communities of practice, I borrowed from him. The idea that learning is situated historically and socioculturally, or situated learning, the term that he and Jean Lave came up with, the idea that it's not an individual act, it's an act that's embedded within history, it's an act that's embedded within relationships between people in a community. The second premise that I thought was important is learning is meaning negotiation and identity development. It's about transforming the individual, transforming the human being. And it's not about absorbing knowledge. It's really an integral part of us as a total human being. And I think that that's something that's generally missed in terms of knowledge and in terms of learning. And that's what actually kind of keeps us in the realm of explicit knowledge rather than the realm of tacit knowledge. The third thing that I subscribe to is the idea that humans are natural learners in a facilitating environment. We naturally do learn, but we need to be in an environment that facilitates that learning, that allows for that learning, that allows for us to express our whole humanness, to promote that kind of learning and promote social learning. So this is where I added on to, and Etienne actually was on my dissertation committee where I did this. I added on to his theories of communities of practice to recognize that his focus was on practice. What I wanted to focus on was the idea of community. So what is a community? What constitutes a community? We talk about community a lot. We still do. It's a very warm word. It's a very inviting word that people like to use. I think people are overusing it right now because they're attributing a community to anything pretty much that involves people. I'm very specific about community. And to me, community requires what I call a covenantal relationship rather than a contractual relationship. Now, most of our life is about a contractual exchange. It's about you give me something, I give you something. This locks us into really tangible kinds of things. Again, explicit kinds of things, behavioral kinds of things. It doesn't allow for the connection of human beings that are really necessary for tacit knowledge to really be mobilized. So a covenant, I borrowed it actually from religion. It's a prominent theme in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but it's also become a political science term. But the idea is that the relationship is not just an exchange. It's not just a quid pro quo, you give me something, I give you something. It is a permanent, morally infused relationship of responsibility. And by being in a community, we have a responsibility to each other and to the community to participate, to share, to connect, to help others. And it really unifies the dignity of the individual and the unity of the collective. And this is what's difficult because this is paradoxical. And what I've realized with tacit knowledge and all the things that support tacit knowledge is that a lot of times we're dealing with paradox and we're dealing with contrasts that shouldn't exist together but do. So if you think about it, the individual it's necessary to be separate, but at the same time you're part of a collective and you need to be actually part of a group. And those two conflict with each other. And so part of living in a community and living in a covenantal relationship is accepting this relationship, of this tension of relationship that is between contrasts or between opposites. And this is what makes things difficult. What we try to do is we try to eliminate that conflict. We try and eliminate that tension to simplify things. And by doing that, we actually move away from tacit knowledge. We move to more explicit knowledge, which is easier to document, easier to put in place, certain, sure, rather than uncertain, undetermined, intangible. And those are things that lead to paradox. And so what's important here is the idea that if we work in a community of practice, that we're really creating a different sense of relationship. So in my work then, and this is when I was at Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company, I worked on this. And really what I came up with is a different idea of what community of practice was and how this fed into knowledge and tacit knowledge. So my definition is a community of practice is a group of people brought together by common belief, common behavior, and a sense of belonging. So there are three B's: belief, behavior, and belonging, who strive to enhance their dominant work practice. There's a sense of commitment and stewardship to the work practice that's embedded within the community itself. That's the thing that unifies everyone together. So what this does is basically, in an organization, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll have a team, a project team. Some people call it a work community. I don't like calling it that. I call it a project team. And what that does is it focuses on the tangibles, what's being delivered, the project work. It's usually run by organizational leadership, and organizational leadership is really more influenced by structural thinking. It's influenced by more behavioral thinking. And it's about accountability to the customer and internal focus. But the intersection, the connection, the 90 degrees are these people that bring their practice to the team. And what the community of practice does is it focuses on the how. And the how is rich in tacit knowledge, rich in new ways of thinking about things, intangibles. And really, it changes the model, or even the organizational model that facilitates this, to a distributed leadership model. It's not about accountability, which is connected with the behavioral way of thinking, but responsibility. It's that covenantal relationship rather than an exchange relationship. And it's got a more holistic focus on internal and external at the same time. So what this does is, by creating this environment, by creating these relationships, it creates a more chance of having a transfer of tacit knowledge, of connection, because there's a place where people can have the safety they need and also the conversations that they need to be able to do that, which leads to more successful practices, more collaboration and innovation, more expertise growth, a fast ramp up of new members because mentoring becomes part of that process. So it leads to collaborative problem solving and competency building and connection to expertise. And that expertise and that competency and that collaboration is filled with tacit knowledge. And that's what needs to be unleashed. That's what needs to be or to thrive, essentially. So this is what I was working on, is creating these environments. Now, it's difficult to create these environments in a traditional Western organization, because most Western organizations are top-down kind of organizations where leadership tends to be hierarchical. There's a lot of behaviorism that's still embedded within these organizations. A lot of the philosophies of Frederick Taylor from the 1920s, structuralism that's still built in, and that hinders it. So a lot of times what I had to do to allow this to happen was to not allow leadership and management to participate, only allow practitioners to participate in this and foster that type of environment where they could operate, and then let it sort of spread out virally across the organization. So one of the things that came out of this was the concept of intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity is really that connection between people. It's the betweenness of people. And what I found in building these is, excuse me, is that this was an emerging process of starting with a few people, and then it's virally spread to other people. So it started with a development team of a few people where we would dialogue and create concepts of what this would look like, so that we could actually truly understand each other and generate the tacit knowledge even of what it means to be a community, what it means to live in a learning community. And then that was projected then into the next group, which was a core team of people who created the charter, essentially the constitution of the community, the interpretive document, which was an explicit document, but what it was designed to do was to really foster dialogue into the tacit realm of community and community building. And then that was pushed out to members, it was then pushed out to non-members. So this idea of, creating even the process itself of building the community was a process involving tacit knowledge and intersubjectivity between people, of allowing them to connect and have this intangible experience of connecting with each other and understanding and creating a sense of understanding that to some extent was inexpressible. You had to experience it. You had to be part of it to really understand it. Now, this leads me to the third movement, and this is where I am now. It's building on the ideas that are part of the community, because it is still about relationships, but it takes an even broader and maybe more, I don't want to say radical, maybe, approach to this than what I did previously. So the musical theme for this actually comes from Kenneth Gergen, who wrote a book called Relational Being, which is an interesting book that sort of deals with some of these same themes. And he says, learning is not a process of producing effective individuals. It is one of fostering processes that indefinitely extend the potentials of relationship. So you can see that this has changed. The idea of learning has changed, and it's changed to a bigger focus on tacit knowledge. The first one was really about behavioral. Basically, if you see it, it's real. If you don't see it, it's not real. The sociocultural introduced the idea of history and social and cultural connection. This goes even further to say that the purpose of learning itself, is to extend the potentials of relationship. It's to take relationship as the primary aspect of being human, the primary aspect of all of work, and not the idea of things or objects. So this is kind of taking it to a different level. Now, what is involved here is really thinking in terms of new paradigms. Now, we use paradigm a lot to just mean shifts. This actually does mean a truly different paradigm. We have been operating for a long time, since the Enlightenment, really, using thinking that has been very successful for us. So if we think back on physics, we think about atoms, that we are a bunch of atoms crashing into each other. Each one is an individual atom that's in a meaningless universe where basically there's cause and effect of things bouncing off of each other, and that's what defines our universe and our reality. And that's been extended to social understanding as well, how people work. We are all individuals that are crashing into each other in this meaningless world, and we are affected by cause and effect. But in reality, we are just things within a world of things. So a shift in the paradigm really comes from at least in my thinking, comes from two things. One is, again, I bring up McGilchrist. McGilchrist's work on the attention hypothesis. He looked at brain asymmetry. And what he found was that the right and the left half of the brain really pay attention to the world in two totally different ways. One way is very much what we're used to, or has been taking over really our thinking, and it's attached to that kind of Enlightenment sort of thinking, which is things are very structured and predictable, and we try to simplify them as much as possible, and we try to abstract things. We try to create thingness. Now the left or the right side of the brain, on the other hand, operates in a very different way and pays attention in a very different way. It sees things much more holistically. It actually can function as both the right side and the left brain, both types of thinking simultaneously. It's much more skeptical. It's much more questioning. It's much more socially conscious in terms of understanding people and connections and empathy. And both of these sides, the left and the right side, work together. But what's been happening is that the left side has become dominant while the right side has been withering. And the right side really is the unifier and the ability to kind of connect all of these really paradoxes of living together to understand them. Now, the second piece that I have here is modern physics. And I just mentioned that things are different now. Modern physics has explored reality on a very small level and a very large level, and found that it's very different from what we think it is. And instead of things being very predictable and very measurable, and that we can stand back as individuals and be very objective, we can't. And we are parts of a system, and even for scientific thinking, when we look at scientific thinking and we do an experiment, a lot of times the scientist thinks that they're outside of that system, but they're not. They're actually within that system. We are completely entangled in relationships, and what both McGilchrist and modern physics have realized is that really what we think is the world, which is the world is a bunch of things, and those things are interacting and relating to each other. It's actually the other way around. We are bundles of relationships, and those relationships define our thingness. And so I think this is a whole different way of looking at things, and it creates a whole different way of looking at knowledge and a whole different way of looking at tacit knowledge in particular, because it really brings forward what tacit knowledge is and why it's so important. So this leads to two different types of thinking or ways of thinking. So what we're used to a lot, and this comes actually from Greek thought, and it actually is built into that way of thinking that our left brain pushes us to, is the idea of either or thinking. What we do is we strive for consistency. We want things to be the same. We want things to appear the same. We don't like uncertainty. We want to predict things. And if we look at most of the things that we do, we try and control things. We try and measure things so that we can predict them. We can control them. We can know what's going to happen next, because we don't like uncertainty. We don't like unpredictability. We seek one answer. The world itself is really not designed for necessarily one answer. In most cases, there are multiple answers. We recognize really the rational side of organizations. We toss out the emotional side. We talk out those things that are non-rational, intuition, the things that actually are embedded with us in our humanness. And we basically dismiss those as being not real or not effective. Because we are in a contractual sort of relationship, and I'll go back to that, we try to create win-lose scenario. We look at the win-lose scenarios. How can we win? As opposed to looking at things in a more holistic way. And then we also limit our options by doing this. Now, if we look at both and thinking, this is very different. And this is actually going against what basically either or is saying, which is it's not either this or this, it's both this, and those things can actually contradict each other. So instead, what we do with this kind of thinking is we embrace inconsistency as part of reality. We embrace conflict as part of reality, and that things don't necessarily fit together. We don't necessarily have the capability of fitting them completely together. We cope with dynamism, with uncertainty, with risk, with change. Things are changing constantly. We're changing as human beings constantly. So that's part and parcel of being part of life, is that there's change. We're not trying to control it. We're not trying to eliminate it. We're actually embedding ourselves within it and becoming part of it. We look for many different interdependent solutions. We look holistically at things. We look for other possibilities rather than trying to get that one answer, because most things in the world can't be solved with one single answer, and they're usually not solved. They're things that continue to evolve over a period of time. They're messes, or they're wicked problems, as some people call them. We make room for both the rational and the non-rational. We appreciate our emotional side, our intuitive side, and our rational side, and we put those together and try and get the best out of both of them. And we look for win-win scenarios rather than just win-lose scenarios. How can we have both things working at the same time? How can we have two things that seem to conflict with each other actually come out to be better? And that opens us up to possibilities instead of limiting ourselves in terms of our thinking. You could probably see how this reflects more of an environment of tacit knowledge rather than an environment of explicit knowledge, which is more on the left side. So relationality, if we want to distinguish between the relationality versus kind of the structural approach or the thingness approach that we've been taking, what we can do is distinguish them through these types of ways of identifying them. So while talking about it in terms of the brain, The structural approach uses primarily the left brain. The left brain is the control system for that. And it sometimes doesn't even recognize when it's wrong. It will convince you that it's right when it's not necessarily right. The relationality actually looks at both of them, and that they actually can conflict with each other, but they actually need to work together. And as I said, the right brain can actually do both. The right brain can look through things through a lens of the kind of what the left brain sees and the right brain. So it's much more of a powerful control system than just the left brain itself. Relationality is about analytical and synthetic, taking things apart and putting them together, taking them apart to find out how they work, putting them together to find out what they mean. When we talk about the structural approach, a lot of times we abandon meaning. We go to just the analytical. We just look at the pieces. We take things apart into their pieces. Well, that leads to finding explicit knowledge of things. But really, the tacit knowledge is embedded within the synthesis, the meaning that comes out of putting them together, when things are greater than the sum of their parts, not the sum of the parts themselves. As I said, it's both and thinking versus either or thinking. Relations are primary rather than thingness is primary. We are not things first and relationships second. We are relationships first and bundles of relationships first. And then what we do is those coagulate or collapse into things, into our thingness. And those relationships actually change who we are. They change our thingness. They change our being. We focus more on being than on having. Most of modern society is about having things. And that again is an homage to explicitness, to, you can see a thing, you can touch a thing, but being is not. Being is more tacit. Being is much more intangible. This also leads to dialogic inquiry. Dialogue is different from discussion. You'll see in structural, it's about advocating discussion. It's about taking your point of view and pushing it on other people. Dialogue is different. Dialogue is where you do have a point of view, but you throw it out to the table and everyone else throws their ideas out to the table. And there's a possibility of you actually being not subscribing to that when you're done. It may be a combination of what people bring together that you create that's something new. It may be something that changes in you. And so in our world right now, we're very polarized. Polarization is basically that you can never be convinced that the other person is right. Dialogue doesn't allow that. Dialogue allows you to inquire, to find out something new. And then relationality is about emergence, and it's emergent in an infinite environment. While structural is about converging to a finite environment. It's creating finiteness. Tacit knowledge is more about infinity rather than finiteness. And then it's indeterminate and co-created versus deterministic and reductionist. So what we do is, through our relationships, we co-create our reality, we co-create our knowledge, we co-create our situations, and we don't know what those will be. They will unfold over a period of time. Rather than we know what they will be, we always know what they will be, and we assume that we know what they will be. So this leads us to kind of my final thing, which is, okay, so what do we do with this? How do we turn this into our own symphony? So I have some suggestions about kind of coming out of this, and this is sort of what I'm working on. One is Buber talks about two different relationships that we have, that every time we speak I, that we have it's a relationship of I. It's not just a thing of I. So there are two different types of relationships. There's an I-it relationship and there's an I-thou relationship. An I-it relationship is the kind of the connection that we have with things. It's a distance relationship. And those are important relationships. We need those. But an I-thou relationship is a relationship of connection that's different. It's a relationship where you are totally connected relationally, as opposed to it as a thing. The relationship is what is important. The in-between is what is important. Thou comes from the German, because there's a different word for when you have different types of relationships. So it's translated as thou. So what we need to do is we need to welcome and invite those kind of I-thou relationships in, not just I-it relationships, not just relationships where you're connected at a distance to a thing. And sometimes those things are people. We need to allow these. Now, Buber would say that you can't force those relationships. You need to invite them in. They happen. And so we need to be open to those relationships through presence. The second thing is we need to develop dialogue as a core capability of the world order. This is comprised of really 4 pieces. Turning to the other. So this is very other focused. Turning to the other and making sure that you're present with them and addressing them in their whole being, understanding who they are and being present with their whole being, with your whole being, and then listening to them in full presence, not with an agenda, not with your own point of view, but with the opportunity to hear new things, to see new things, and then responding ethically, but also responding as part of a participation. And creating that sense of dialogue together where you can come up with new things together or see new things together. The third thing is to promote covenantal relationships as primary to organizational life, which to me is responsibility to the otherness, to other people, to other relationships. And so it's not necessarily about the self and being trapped in the self. It's really about focusing on the other rather than our contractual relationships, which are about exchange. How can I give you knowledge if you give me knowledge? How can I contribute to a database if you give me $100 or you give me some money? That's not going to lead to tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is going to come through an ethical, moral commitment and relationship to others and to working with others and to being with others in their full humanness. The fourth thing is we need to change our idea of learning. We need to reframe learning as an existential aspect of human being, and that it's co-creation rather than an event, rather than a purpose of controlling or manipulating the world. This is about changing identity. This is about changing who we are as human beings. And then the last thing is we need to become comfortable with integrating that emotional and the non-rational with the cognitive and the rational. We've become very, very rational. Science is not just rational. Science is emotional. Science is non-rational. There's a lot of intuition that's in science, and a lot of science has become scientism, where what it is basically there's only one way of thinking, and that's using a rational scientific method rather than introducing some of the other aspects of our humanity into it, which have led to a lot of the discoveries. Einstein's work was embedded with that a lot. And a lot of modern physics is embedded with that. So there are lots of examples of scientists who actually use their intuition, use their passions, their emotions to come up with ideas. So it's not, again, not an either or, it's a both and they conflict with each other and they find things difficult. So this is the journey that I'm on now. And this is, I throw it out there more to promote dialogue, to point you to something, maybe to open a window and point to something and say, here, do you see this? What do you think? And I'd be really curious to know what your thinking is and questions that you have and to continue the dialogue.
那我们非常感谢 Josh 博士刚才的分享，非常的精彩，而且内容也非常的丰富。那大家如果现在有问题的话 ，Zoom 里的朋友可以开麦，可以直接提问，也可以或者把你的问题打在聊天框里。那我们在各个直播平台看我们讲座的朋友，可以把你的问题，然后直接输在聊天框里。然后我们的嘉宾呢也会看到，然后呢我们也会选取，然后其中一些问题，然后回答。Okay, so the first question, I'll put it in the chat. How to understand learning involves meaning negotiation and identity development.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? So if you think about a community, the conversations that happen we as human beings are constantly searching for meaning. We're trying to understand what things mean. And one way of thinking about it is we can think about meaning as being something that's in our heads. But if we think about it more communally and more relationally, meaning is actually something that we negotiate. We have certain opinions of what they are, and other people have different opinions, and we put those together in sort of a dialogue fashion, and we negotiate what makes sense, almost like a business deal where you're throwing things out and you're trying to come up with a solution together. And so instead of meaning being individual, meaning comes out in terms of this negotiation process, and that leads to learning. That helps us learn our environment, that helps us learn subjects, that helps us learn about truth, and all of those kinds of things. That also is involved with identity development, because who
Dr.
we are.
Josh,
Yeah.
Yes, I'll translate from here.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I'll translate from here. Yes. You speak several sentences, I'll translate, and then you speak, I translate.
Oh, translate. Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
好，我们第一个问题呢，是我们刚才 PPT 就分享的时候，我们博士说了一句话，就是学习它就涉及到意义的协商和身份的发展。那这句话该如何理解？首先，为什么学习它跟那个意义协商有关系？就是这个呢，涉及到比如说我们在一个群体中进行对话。因为我们人就是总是倾向于去寻找意义，然后这个意义可能存在在我们的大脑里。但是在就是人与人之间的关系当中，比如说在一个社群，在一个组织里面，我们需要跟别人进行协商，就是把我们的不同的意见、不同的想法都抛出来，然后大家通过对话，然后进行一个新的意义的建构，然后找到就是更合理、更有价值的解释。那这样的协商呢，也是一个能够导致我们学习的一个过程，就是能够让我们比如说学习到可能不同的学科，可能不同的真理。那这个呢，就是关于这个学习意义协商的这个概念。那么接下来我们再看一下为什么学习它跟身份的发展也有关系。Doctor, please.
Okay.
Yeah, please continue.
So that leads to identity development, which is by taking that, then we become different people. And that the learning becomes part of who we are and creates different people. It's not just absorption of knowledge. It's actually changing who we are as human beings. And that's the integrated part of learning.
关于这个身份的这个发展是说，因为我们就是这个学习的过程，并不是说简单的仅仅吸收的过程，它同时也是帮我们重新塑造自我的过程。我们会可能在这个学习当中，我们可能发现了自身可能需要改变的地方，然后呢，我们也因此而做到了一个真正的变化。那所以说，学习呢，更多是可能关于我们，更多的是关于我们一个身份的建构，而不仅仅是停留在知识的吸收层面上。Thank you for your answer. Okay, the second question is about the either or and both and thinking. Thank you for your interesting sharing. And how to mobilize the both and thinking when we fall into the trap of either or thinking?
That's it. That's a good question. And actually, it gets very complex because both and thinking includes either or thinking. So if we truly think about both and thinking, it's both and thinking and either or thinking. That's really how it would work. A lot of this comes through practice. We have to be able to question ourselves more and be much more conscious of things and not be uncomfortable with things that don't seem to make sense. Again, it's sort of practicing our left brain and our right brain, allowing our right brain to have a little bit more practice, being a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty, being a little bit more comfortable with ideas that conflict with each other, and looking at those as opportunities rather than as reasons for oversimplifying things. So actually, it's interesting. Well, I'll let you translate that first, and then I'll tell one more piece.
好，第二个问题呢，就是比较有趣的，是说我们刚刚在 演讲里面提到了就是2个思维，一个是两者都，一个是要么要么。那如何就是在我们陷入这个要么要么思维这个陷阱的时候，去调动我们的这个两者都思维？那这个其实是可以，就是通过不断的练习来实现。就是我们要，比如说经常向自己提问，然后让自己有意识的去训练自己的大脑。那比左脑跟右脑相比呢，我们要就是更有意识的去训练自己的左脑，就是让自己的左脑能够去更接受那些可能让自己觉得不太舒服的那些想法、那些冲突、那些不确定性，就是把它更多的视作一个机会。
And I think we can look to more ancient thought and ancient wisdom for some ways of looking at this. Buddhism, ancient Judaism, Christian mysticism, a lot of different traditions, and even different kinds of Greek philosophy, like Heraclitus and some of the pre-Socratic philosophers thought this way. And so a lot of times what we can do is go back to those old traditions and kind of look at how they did that and use some of their wisdom for understanding it, and then try to apply it to our own world. We've lost a lot of those traditions, and I think that some of those traditions have some of the keys as to how to do that.
那还有一个做的就是这样的做的方法是，我们就是尽量的可以去回归传统。那比如说一些传统的思想，比如说像古希腊的想法，一些像宗教的，像佛教、基督教，一些传统的，就很多过去的我们伟大的哲学家他们的思想，我们可以去回归到传统思想，去运用那些古人的智慧来帮助我们。
Okay, hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And considering the time, and we'll have the last question.
How did you find out your real career passion through learning? You know, it fell on me. I've always liked to learn, and I actually got a job after I started a graduate program, didn't like it, and I left, and I had to get a job. I ended up getting a job in an educational software company. Where I could actually think both in terms of my computer sort of left brain mind and my creative right brain mind. And when I did that, and that was in the early 80s, when I did, or mid 80s, and when I did that, I realized that just seeking knowledge in general was what my passion was, and teaching and learning and finding anything. If you look around my office that I'm sitting in here, I have books all over the place from every topic, from quantum physics to religion to philosophy. And to me, everything offers an opportunity for learning something. And learning is an attitude rather than an event. So I became more passionate about it. It's not a traditional career. My mom would say, you know, why didn't you become a doctor, or, you know, a physician? Why didn't you become an accountant or whatever? This is not as traditional. But for me, I fell into it and tried to make it my own, and who I was and what my identity was and where my relationships are important. So that's how I fell into it.
那第3个问题是，就是问我们的博士，是他如何是通过学习发现自己真正的这个职业激情、职业热情所在。那这个问题呢，就是也问得很好，就是我其实一直以来我都非常的喜欢学习。那当时毕业以后呢，其实那个时候我还没有真正找到自己的这个职业兴趣。那个时候也是为了找到一份工作，然后我去了一家软件公司，然后那个时候一边从事着这个可能计算性的这些工作，然后可能来训练我的左脑，然后同时也有创意性的一方面来训练我的这个右脑。然后大概是也是上个世纪80年代中期的时候，我就是慢慢发现了我可能对知识和学习方面的东西感兴趣。那如果大家其实可以看到我的这个书房的话，其实发现我看了很多类型的书，可能有像物理学的书、宗教类的、哲学类的，各个类型的都有。因为我会把很多的机会，每一次机会都视作一个学习的一个好的机会。 然后对我而言，学习呢，它更多的是一种态度，而不是说简单的只是一个行为。那在当时也是整个我的这个职业生涯过程中，大家看到我的更多的焦点是放在这个知识，然后比如隐性知识方面、学习方面，这是我就是工作的核心点。它不是像传统的职业那样，像我的妈妈也曾经问我，为什么我不去做医生，不去做会计，或者说像别人那样去做律师？但那都不是我的兴趣。那我的兴趣呢，就是对知识还有学习、组织发展感兴趣。那我也就是这样在真正学习的过程当中，然后找到了自己真正的热爱。Thank you, Dr. Josh. Thank you for your great sharing and great answers. I think that's all for today's Q&A and for today's webinar. Thank you again for your time early in the morning.
Thank you. It's
yeah,
a pleasure.
Yeah, after the webinar, I will send you an email about the feedback from the audience and also how many people were watching online the webinar.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.
我们非常感谢我们的博士今天的分享。同时在这里，我跟大家分享一下我们的一个重磅的活动，是在今年的11月12日到14日，在瑞士达沃斯，我们即将举行第2届全球组织隐性知识管理论坛。那关于本次论坛的具体信息以及相关的门票信息，大家可以扫右下方的二维码，然后进一步了解，也可以登录我们的官方网址3w.GO-TKM.org，然后进一步了解。另外，在论坛的第1天，也就是11月12日，我们将举行全球绿色大奖的颁奖典礼。这里绿色大奖、学习大奖是为了表彰在绿色学习领域取得杰出成就的组织和个人。我们这里提倡的绿色学习与其他形式的学习不同，是主要强调隐性知识的萃取与传承，然后倡导动态学习、终身学习，减少试错式学习。那本次奖项我们主要设置了1个个人奖和3个3类组织奖。那任何在绿色学习方面取得重大贡献的组织和个人都可以参与我们奖项的评选。通过我们奖项评选的组织和个人呢，将有机会然后到达沃斯现场，然后亲自领奖，并且有机会在全球观众面前分享自己在绿色学习方面的最佳实践。那关于这次绿色学习大奖的提名表，大家可以扫右下方的二维码，同时也对本次颁奖典礼的信息然后有一个详细的了解。那这次提名表的提交截止时间是2023年的8月31日，我们欢迎感兴趣的组织和个人然后加入我们。最后是对今天活动的一个反馈，然后我们是非常邀请大家能够就花点时间，然后呢扫右方的二维码，然后留下大家对本次讲座的意见，也方便我们更好的服务大家。今天的讲座就到这里，我们下期再见，晚安。